When we think of the Middle Ages, especially sitting where we are right now, we might bring to mind stained glass windows, Gothic churches, eventually flying buttresses. But we would probably also bring to mind the deep misery of the vast majority of people who lived in the peasant class on a subsistence basis, and of the extraordinary violence of that era, which gave a claim to people who entered into the field of what was called chivalry, but often ended in death. In other words, the Middle Ages are a time of deep contrasts in our recollection, and those deep contrasts are, in fact, quite accurate. The question arises, why should this be? How could we see such astonishing artistic progress and at the same time what amounts to social decay? One reason for that simply has to do with the fate of the Roman Empire. Just as Roman emperors were celebrating the fact of one emperor, one faith, one empire, invincible, Alaric and his Goths sacked Rome in the year 410. Now, in retrospect, because we in the West tend to have an exaggerated sense of Rome's importance, that will seem to be an utter disaster. And to Western writers, such as St. Augustine, who was writing in Latin, didn't have the education to speak Greek, it was indeed a deep blow. But for the Roman Empire as a whole, whose capital was now in Constantinople, named after you-know-who, they have simply lost the equivalent of part of New Jersey. It wasn't all that bad. They were still getting their products from the West. In France, they weren't even making wine yet. They were making beer in France, if that can be conceived. And the strategic border of the empire on the east could still be shored up, because the most important threat that the Romans sensed throughout this entire period came from Persia under various dynasties. So you can lose Rome and it doesn't do all that much harm, unless you happen to live in Rome, or in today's France, today's Spain, today's Great Britain, today's Germany. All of those places were left to try to organize themselves. And as a result, they looked increasingly to the authority of bishops living in cities, metropolitan areas, organizing the life of the community. And the result of that was the emergence of a distinctive culture which was focused on three activities which we're going to deal with today. Those activities were ascetical practice, atonement, and finally, holy war. We'll look at each of these in turn and consider how it is that they amount to a medieval synthesis, a way of viewing the world and of understanding the human place within it that resulted in another shift in the system of the Christian religion, which we have been tracing through the course of these lectures. So the first kind of activity, ascetical practice. What do we mean by that? This comes from the term, and you can see it's on the first page on your sheet, in Greek, which is ascesis. Ascesis in itself does not refer necessarily to a religious practice. Ascesis, in Ordinary Greek means training, exercise, development of oneself for a purpose. So, for example, it can be used in the context of war. And the early Christian martyrs, from the time of the 2nd century of the Common Era, were frequently compared to soldiers. This at a time, of course, 2nd century, when there was no possibility whatever of a Christian actually serving in the military, because at that time they were dedicated to the worship of the emperor in the military. But there was a comparison between the strategic willingness to suffer on the part of a martyr with the training that a soldier might undergo. And so the 2nd century writer Tertullian, among others, made this comparison between the dedicated martyr and the trained soldier. There are times when actual descriptions of martyrdom result in our seeing how deep this comparison worked within the imagination of early Christians. You can see that in the first quotation. It's inside the box on page 1. This comes from a document known as the Martyrdom of Perpetua. Perpetua was a wealthy woman at a time when Christians were still being systematically persecuted. Her family tried to convince her to avoid suffering in the stadium. She refused to do that. And Perpetua had a dream just prior to her actual martyrdom. And what you see here is a quotation from her dream. And as I knew I had been condemned to the beasts, I was amazed that they did not send them out at me. And an Egyptian with a vicious look came out against me with his seconds to fight me. Now, why, you might ask, an Egyptian? This refers to the Roman emperor of the time. This is the Roman Emperor Severus from the 3rd century of the Common Era. Severus, as part of the cult of the worship of the Roman emperor, decided that he was really the Egyptian god Serapis. And as a result, if you look at coins of the Emperor Severus, you'll see that his hair is curled in the manner of this Greek god. It used to be that emperors had complexes about their divinity, about like American wrestlers today. And in the vision of Perpetua, that is how the emperor now is appearing to her. And handsome young men came out to me as seconds and supporters, as if these were two gladiators who were about to meet one another. And I was stripped naked and became a man. And my supporters began to rub me down with oil as they do before combat. We see here the theme of a complete transformation of the martyr's identity in the midst of the suffering. And this is actually a feature that you will find frequently in the literature of martyrdom. Now, most of this literature, as we have it, comes from the period after the conversion of Constantine. The martyrdom of Perpetua is helpful because here's a case where we know it comes from prior to that. But what is usually called the cult of the martyrs truly flourished after Constantine's conversion. It then became safe to praise such people, and they also became models for other Christians. And the underlying motivation is provided by a statement that Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, made in his work on the Incarnation, which you can see between the two boxes on page 1, God became man that man might become God. Now you see here two features. One is, remember, Athanasius was a key leader in the development of the idea of the Trinity that we discussed last week. The notion that Christ's identity is to be seen as eternal and something that cannot be damaged by any earthly consideration. And because that's the case, human beings who follow his example themselves come to share the identity of Christ. This is one reason for which the Trinity became a fundamental doctrine within that period of classic Christianity that we discussed last week. If Christ is truly divine, it offers the prospect that those who follow him can share in that divinity. And the saint was understood to do precisely that, to bring Christ's divinity all the closer to everyone who believed in him. And so you have the quotation towards the bottom of page 1 from Augustine's City of God, which I will not go through. I'll leave that for you in your leisure. But just mention that when Augustine speaks of the way that the remains of a saint have healing power, this became a key idea in the Christian West. And the reason for it was that the martyred saint was understood at the point of death to be transformed into the identity of Christ, to share his divinity, so that the remains of a saint, which were called relics, were understood to have a transformative power to those who were near them. This would become the basis of pilgrimage sites. It also featured in the practice that whenever you had an altar which had been set up in order to celebrate the Eucharist, there should be a relic of a saint built in to that altar. And this is still the case that you will find as you travel throughout Europe. I have a very good friend in the north of Germany in a town called Fechte. He is the equivalent of a provost, a Propst of a church there. And he once invited my wife and me to spend the weekend with him. He was recently made the Propst, which in his mind was clearly as good as Pope. And I said, of course, in fact, although he had more power. But anyway, we went to Fechte, and he took us through his school, and there is a gym, and there is a youth club, and it's a beautiful old medieval church. And he comes into the chapel there, which has been dedicated in the name of St. George, the same George as George and the Dragon. And he goes up to the altar, and he takes down two gauntlets, such as a knight would wear on one forearm and the other forearm. And he puts both gauntlets into the hands of my wife. And she's holding these two things, and he says to her, "Can you tell which one really has his forearm in it?" It's slightly heavier. Well, unfortunately, she almost lost both of them, but didn't. She held on to them. And what this represents to this day is the notion that proximity to the saint brings about holiness, transformation, and ultimately healing. As we get into this period, after the conversion of Constantine, the question naturally arises, but how can we do this now? We are in a political position where it is safe to praise the martyr, But we really don't have a machine for martyrdom compared to what there was earlier, prior to the time of Constantine. One way in which there was compensation for this was to begin, as early as the 4th century, to begin to portray the actual Christian soldier as a saint. To say that someone who battles on behalf of the Trinitarian Roman Empire, when he goes to battle, is offering himself in martyrdom. His service is a sacrifice. This language may sound familiar to you, because that is when, during the 4th century, it entered the Western ideology of warfare that the soldier who risked his life is as good as someone who is willing to spend his life for the sake of a given cause, and in this case, therefore, to be given the status of the martyr. So, for example, those who went to war against Alaric and the Goths were seen as martyrs and saints, although Alaric himself was also a Christian. Only he was not a Trinitarian Christian. He did not accept this idea of the full divinity of Jesus, and therefore barbarians, heretics, and pagans were all seen as the equivalent of the old persecuting Roman Empire. That is one method to compensate for the conversion of Constantine. And another is to say that we today do not suffer for our faith because anyone persecutes us, but we can undertake this training, this ascesis, in ourselves. And that is how the term ascetical practice comes to us now. Because the idea of deliberately fasting, of not taking part in pleasures that might be available in a given society, a deliberate denial of the self, so that one can follow Christ by taking up his cross and following him, not because there's anyone persecuting, but because you take on the discipline of ascetical practice. And one can see the transition into this notion of ascesis within another writer we saw last week, who was a major contributor to the idea of the Trinity, namely Gregory of Nyssa. And you see him right in the middle of page 2, inside that box. Gregory of Nyssa published the life of Macrina. Macrina was his own sister, and he went and visited her. He was a bishop. He went and visited with her quite frequently. She practiced monasticism. She undertook a major style of life which accorded with this idea of ascesis. How can you best fast? How can you best withdraw from the temptations of the world? Answer: don't live in the city. Go out and be alone. Be monachos in Greek. This is where we get the term monastic, and in shortened form where we get the term monk. Go live out there in the eremos, in the wilderness. Eremos, therefore become a hermit. And the conception is that by constant meditation on the scriptures, prayer, and fasting, it will be possible for you to come nearer and nearer to Christ. The end is theosis. The end is becoming godlike in the course of one's ascetical practice. Macrina, the sister of Gregory, represented this ideal in his mind better than Gregory himself. Gregory thought, I'm a mere bishop. I spend my life in talk and writing, trying to make my church work. Macrina, my sister, is the real thing. She engages in ascesis. As a result of that, when he came to visit with her towards the end of her life, an end, by the way, which was hastened by her degree of fasting, Gregory took down everything that she said. And it became one of the major documents for the practice of ascesis within the West forever after. And so she says, near the time of her death, in a prayer, "Thou that didst break the flaming sword, and didst restore to paradise the man that was crucified with thee, and implored thy mercies, remember me too in thy kingdom." Observe that this is a prayer directly to Christ. Now, Christ's eternity is so understood that he is the accessible part of God. So prayer is directed towards him. "Because I too was crucified with thee, having nailed my flesh to the cross for fear of thee." Asceticism becomes the equivalent in the life of the saint of crucifixion in the life of Jesus. "And of thy judgments have I been afraid. Let not the terrible chasm separate me from thy elect, nor let the slanderer stand against me in the way, nor let my sin be found before thy eyes. If in anything I have sinned in word or deed or thought, led astray by the weakness of our nature." When you move the practice of ascesis from the field of martyrdom to the field of interior discipline, then the great problem that emerges is no longer how to find courage. Courage was obviously the big issue when martyrdom was a prospect. The issue for ascetical practice is rather, how do I overcome sin within myself? It is a part of the shifting of the field of where the battle takes place with the enemy. And as a consequence, characteristically, medieval spirituality was consumed by the issue of sin in a way that earlier forms of spirituality had not been. It was a consequence of its notion of aesthetical practice. And you can see that I've given the example of how it was that Gregory the Great, then Bishop of Rome, in that time called Papa, Pope, referred to his own congregation. He was speaking to a group of male monks and explained to them how they should practice their devotion. And he said to them, you should be like Mary Magdalene. You should understand that your own background is that of sin, and that therefore only devotion will be able to lead you through this thicket. And this conception of regular, disciplined devotion as a corrective to sin within ascetical practice, where the aim is union with God, becomes the basis of the monastic movement. I gave you the example, this is over on page 3, of the hours of Saint Benedict of Nursia. Saint Benedict founded the Benedictines, the order, not the brandy, and he did so for the purpose of organizing in the West, on a collective basis, the kind of isolated practice which already took place in the east of the empire. The east of the empire was basically a safer place than the west. In the west, if you wish to practice contemplation, you would better do it on a collective basis. There were those who were able to find protection enough to be able to live as hermits, but the characteristic form of Western practice became the monastery, the place of contemplation. And it would be there that you would mark out your day according to matins, which means prayer in the night, lauds, which means praise, which you offer at dawn, prime, first, just before you go to work, tierce, third hour, mid-morning, sect, round about now, midday, none, middle of the afternoon, usually around 3, vespers, evening worship, and finally compline, just before sleep. And you thought people were exaggerated during the 19th century going to church twice a day. Here we see a very carefully planned understanding of how you can live the course of your life in the presence of God. You do so by organizing your daily routine, including sleep and waking and work and eating and going to sleep at the end of the day. And during the same period, you are also organizing the annual calendar so that throughout Christendom, you follow a consistent practice of a prolonged fast prior to Easter, known as Lent in the West, which originally simply meant spring. You also celebrate the fruits of the earth during the season known as Trinity, which is in the entirety of the summertime. This leads you into Advent, long about now, just slightly later, where you look forward to the judgment of Christ, and you undertake another fast. Advent is another penitential season. It is not the time for Christmas shopping. Advent is deliberately set up so that just as before Easter, so before the celebration of the Incarnation, you also undertake a fast by way of preparation. Time itself comes to be seen under the perspective of eternity, within a consciousness that sees, for all the differences there are in Europe and to the East, reaching into Russia, there is nonetheless a single Christendom, focused on this issue of how it might be possible to become, and look at this second entry, to become at one with God. Atonement is actually a made-up word in English. It does mean at one-ment. That is, it focuses on the issue of how believers can become one with God, which means overcoming what separates them from the divine, namely sin itself. Wouldn't you like to know how to overcome sin itself? That we'll do next week. I thank you very much indeed for your attention and for coming along today. Al has a question.
I would expect that the term the Dark Ages is a modern name. Where does it come from, or if it just is modern and useless, tell us.
Yeah, it is modern, but not completely useless. The idea of the Dark Ages comes about because it is extremely difficult for historians to get their hands on the kind of information they would like to have about this period. And the fact is that as compared to the kind of record keeping that you had within the Roman Empire, if you are trying to figure out what was going on just to the north, for example, of a small French town where I spent some time during the summers, you're in trouble. There, It's wonderfully quiet today. I say to my friends, basically you can hear the grass grow during the summer. But it was once a Roman market town, which was then converted during the Middle Ages into a marketplace. And you can see the remains of this architecture, of a stadium, an agora, of hot baths, an aqueduct. And right now we know nothing about it apart from what we can see. We have no historical records that permit us to understand how this facility got there and was then converted during the time of the Middle Ages. Now, why should this be the fact? Well, one possible reason that used to be favored by people like Edward Gibbon in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is, and you sometimes hear this on blogs as a new explanation of why we're living in the way we are right now, is Christianity makes you stupid. That is, that the conversion of Europe resulted in people forgetting how to write, and they didn't know anything more about history. Well, except that those histories we have are written by people like Bede, who was a monk in the north of England, and Eusebius, who we encountered last week, who is a bishop, so that the notion that people just kind of lost curiosity doesn't appear to be plausible. However, one thing is clear, and that is the shift in political economy from the empire to the feudal system did involve a great deal of decentralization. And there's another feature. And here I think the Enlightenment in its representatives is not always aware of its own behavior. In many places where there were records, the great warriors of the Enlightenment at the end of the 18th century burned them down. Right? In the case of France, I recently did some work on Mary Magdalene and discovering the exact shape of the veneration of Mary Magdalene in one of her central shrines called Vézelay, right near Paris, is impossible because the revolutionaries, in the name of what they called the cult of pure reason, came into town, tore down the altar. No one knows what happened to this skeleton, which was said to have belonged to Mary Magdalene. They did something with it, but it isn't here anymore. They gutted the place, they rededicated it to reason, and they burned all the archives. So, you know, if you burn it all out, sure enough, there's not going to be evidence there, but it's not because the people are stupid. It's because you have a combination of circumstances that are making sources of the kind you would hope for scarce. And having said that, more recent work on the Middle Ages has tended to backpedal on this notion of Dark Ages because it's been discovered by historians that if you are willing to look through the evidence that is there, although it hasn't yet been packaged into a history, in many cases there are records that give you the raw materials that can tell you what was going on in various communities. The result of that has been there has been an increase in the field of medieval history over the course of the past 60 years. Turns out to be a minor growth industry within the discipline of historical studies. Yes, please. Bob.
I just want to make one note that Rabbi Eichhorn, or Rabbi Emeritus at Temple Manual, used to speak of Yom Kippur as a day of atonement, and then he would say a day of wonderment with God. I thought he had made it up.
No, he didn't make it up, and in fact, Rabbi Einhorn, rediscovered the exact place where translators of the Bible came up with the term atonement. When they came to Yom Kippur, they looked at this term Kippur, or the equivalent etymologically Kippur, And they said, how do we go about expressing the idea that it's possible for a human being to enter into relation with God, to offer worship to God, and as a result of that, to bridge the chasm between that person and God. We really don't have a term like Kippur in English. It doesn't exist, they said. And so, because the term one-mint already had existed, this appears to have existed from around the 14th century. The idea, when you reconcile two people, you can bring them to one mint. It's a nice thought, actually. Get to one mint between two opposing parties. We use them one mint in Washington right now. And so when they came to the idea of Kippur, of making something at one, they said, at one mint. Exactly so.
Thank you. And the other thought I had was some of this aesthetic movement a reaction to, we read about the Middle Ages, known as the Dark Ages, but as a time of great partying and sexual wild, all those things. Was this something of a withdrawal from?
Yes, to some extent, aesthetical practice does represent an attempt to get away from what we're seeing as being excessive practices, whether in the Roman period or later on in the Middle Ages. And the result of that was that you could also find people who made a point of not following ascetical practice and gave visible evidence of that. One thinks of Henry VIII, for example. Yes, please.
Perpetua's dream of becoming a man and peaceful for her unity with Christ, could that have been in any way connected with the still floating around Gospel of Mary Magdalene?
This is an excellent question. The dream of Perpetua involves her perception of herself as male. Could this have to do with the Gospel of Mary, which refers to Mary Magdalene, who is portrayed within the Gospel of Mary as coming to the other disciples just after Jesus' resurrection? And the other disciples are completely bereft of anything like courage. They realize that the risen Christ has just sent them out in order to preach in his name and to heal, and they say to one another, damn, if they crucified him, what are they going to do to us? And they don't want to do it. They are in mourning, not because Jesus has died, they're in mourning because he rose from the dead. Ordinarily, you would think this would be the end of it. We can go back to fishing. And while they're wailing, while they're crying with one another, Mary Magdalene, who's had in the Gospel of Mary her separate encounter with the risen Jesus, comes in and says to them, Christ has made us men. So there is definitely a connection between the idea of any martyr becoming like a male warrior, whether male or female, and the idea of Mary Magdalene also transcending the difference between the genders. You also have a similar theme at the very end of the Gospel according to Thomas. At the end of Thomas, Peter, who always holds the short end of the stick, it's not for nothing Jesus called him Rocky. Peter says to Jesus, send Mary from us, for females are not worthy to enter into the kingdom. And Jesus says, see, I've made her male. And every female who makes herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, this is obviously a very odd kind of inclusive language. You know, it operates on the assumption, and this is the ancient assumption. It's something I just want to stress. This is by no means an invention of these particular sources, which are both related to martyrdom and related to gnosis. It would also be true of Platonic sources, Aristotelian sources, Judaic sources, Persian sources of the same period. You have this notion that the first human being was Adam. And basically, whatever Adam looked like, it was more male than female. That we may think of primordial humanity as being in some sense ambivalent, but it is more in the male direction. With the result that when they thought of everyone becoming more human, they moved in a male direction. So I stress this in dealing with my students because it's just something you have to become accustomed with. That is the way they're speaking. They have not at all made the move, which we have recently made, rather to see gender as a more balanced divine creation. Another example is St. Augustine. I'll just mention this because he actually deals with this issue in the City of God. His idea of relics, as I said, is that the saint brings you into contact with the holy, and therefore that transforms. Ultimately, this is going to mean that you, with the saints, are going to be raised from the dead. Now, are you raised male and female? Or are you raised as a generic humanity, which is neither male nor female? Augustine takes a chapter of the City of God to deal with this question. And he finally decides, first, that there must be a cross. And some of them, as part of their ascetical practice, also decided to become missionaries. One of the missionary territories they went to was Italy. That is, they would go through Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, and from their point of view, it was time to reach some of the villages which had in fact been cut off, with the result that they prepared their own histories, their hymns, they developed their own particular methods of ascetical practice. One way in which a monk would mark himself as someone dedicated to asceticism was to keep what was called the tonsure. And the tonsure that we see in films that Friar Tuck, for example, wears is known as the royal tonsure. That's the shaving of the head at the back. But the Celtic tonsure was a shaving of the head at the front. I've always been proud that I have both tonsures. But that practice was so strong that it required a formal decision in England that the Roman rather than the Celtic tonsure was going to be followed. And there's no doubt but that learning in Great Britain was preserved much more by the Irish monastics, who also got themselves up, the Celts got themselves up into Scotland as well, than by any other single force. Because meditation and study were also understood as being ascetical practices. And teaching was understood to be a form of self-denial, which any teacher will tell you is absolute God truth. And as a result of that, it meant that monasteries typically had schools. No one else is doing schooling. No one else has letters or can pass them on. But this can occur in monasteries, and it also becomes possible for people to give their children into the care of monasteries, either for the purpose of increasing their education or simply because they could not afford them. When we come later to the issue of the Reformation, this will be seen as an abuse. How can you take a child in at the age of 9 to a monastery and commit her to the vows of monasticism? In the Dark Ages, that's a sensible decision. By the time of the Reformation, it will be seen as something that needs to be corrected. But as you can see, we're some time for the Reformation, because I got myself too interested in ascesis today. But I think it's vital to understand that basic principle of the medieval synthesis, because then next week we can deal with the issue of how you overcome sin, atonement, and also how this leads in to the practice of holy war as a virtue. That is one of the most difficult things for anyone to understand. And I don't expect anyone to approve it. But holy war is typically seen as just obviously wrong root and branch. And what I'm interested in doing is seeing why it is there, how it becomes emblematic of the medieval synthesis. Because whatever we may think, Richard III would not have agreed. St. Francis of Assisi would not have agreed. St. Francis of Assisi joined a crusade. The present Pope doesn't mention that. He joined a crusade. He tried to convert the Muslims. And if he didn't, he was quite happy to see holy war go on. So I want to understand how that can be part of the medieval synthesis before I know whatever happens, I'm going to think it's a bad idea. I'm not going to recommend it. But I think as a simple matter of historical integrity, one has to know, why did it happen? What were they thinking? How did this come about? You asked, I answered. Is that okay?
That's okay. I just want to affirm, I can't remember because it's a long time ago.
Okay.
But the monks in Ireland were not to offend anybody who's Irish, but they were not really Irish. They were mostly...
Trevor raises an interesting point. Wouldn't you know, St. Patrick was a Brit? Who else would have got rid of the snakes from Ireland? Yeah, exactly. I mean, St. Patrick was a Roman slave. He was captured by the Celts. He was released, and he liked it. He went back, resulting in a major change in Irish culture. Yeah. Betsy.
In the early church, now people are elected, but these leaders that came forth, is it by reason of their intellect that they were listened to, or did they have rivals?
Yeah. Excellent question. Yeah. By what means do we decide positions of leadership within the church at this time? Sometimes, believe it or not, there are actually elections. But it's not election by everybody. It's election by the people that count. The most famous example of this was Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, who was very popular, recently converted to Christianity, not ordained, but he was elected Bishop of Milan. And therefore, he had to be run through the other orders in record time for him to be able to do that. Now, it's quite clear that his election was not simply democratic enthusiasm. He had been governor of a Roman province. And the good people of Milan understood, if our bishop in the new dispensation after Constantine has a background in imperial administration, we are going to do much better. And for the most part, the position of bishop as metropolitan leader, as long as you're within the ambit of the Roman Empire, is going to be under the influence of the emperor directly. The emperor is basically going to appoint and exile whom he will, usually on the basis of guidance from the large councils. But this system, let's say, is not after the fall of Rome, is not going to work in Spain or France or Great Britain because we really are cut off from the empire. This is where the papacy becomes more influential. Then you look to the oldest bishop in your area, that would be Rome, and Rome increasingly will pick up influence on the decision of who will be a bishop. That's only bishops. During the time of the Middle Ages, leaders of monasteries are as important, and in some cases more important, than bishops. Why? They can read and write rather well. They also have more property. Monasteries have very large agricultural lands at a time when agriculture is wealth. And therefore, the head of a monastery or a convent might well have more effective power than a bishop. So it is frequently said that Hildegard of Bingen is a far more influential figure during her time than any bishop in her area. The breakdown of Roman authority, although it clearly had its downside, results in an enormous amount of experimentation, which means that long before the idea of democracy would take root, very long before, because most people still don't think democracy is a good idea. Even those you might think would like it, think it would just be dreadful during this period. But despite the lack of consensual democracy, there is nonetheless a great deal of fragmentation which is producing experiments. So experiments in different types of governance and leadership are occurring right the way through the so-called Dark Ages. Yes, please.
Still, in relation to the Irish monastery, I had this question that says, was it just strictly because Patrick migrated to Ireland that became a focus of the monastic movement in Ireland? But it doesn't answer the question, why was the early Catholic Church so influenced by the Irish monastery?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. Why the degree of monasticism in Ireland, and also why was it so influential? First, on the issue of degree. Bear in mind that all forms of monasticism, except those cases where you might devote your child to a monastery, except for such cases, basically monasticism is a voluntary movement. It's one of the few things you could do entirely voluntarily during the period of the Roman Empire and during the period of the Middle Ages. And therefore, places associated with monasticism attract those who want to pursue that way of life. This is true of the Desert Fathers. In Egypt, they lived in the wilderness. They come to be known as the Desert Fathers. They are very influential. Another group in the Cappadocian Mountains in Turkey, Cappadocian Fathers. And then the Irish monasteries as well, because these are relatively undeveloped wilderness areas. They're also areas of mission where if a monk has success among the local people, he will find a resonance and a welcome. Monks are basically trying to put into practice Jesus' commission to his apostles when he tells them, when you go to preach, go to those places that accept you. And so Ireland became one of those places. And the influence on wider Christianity is, I think, best explained because the Irish monks, obviously there's a Turkish monk who would dispute what I'm about to say. The Irish monks were, on the whole, better educated. Better educated than monks generally speaking. And they valued the role of education. And at the same time, they combined this with a reputation for heroic asceticism. Not everybody could sail the way they could. Not everyone had the ability to enter into difficult missionary fields. So when you combine their reputation for holiness and their education, their influence on the rest of the church, I think becomes explicable. The Cardinal of Red Hook has given me his signal. I will not tell you what it is, but we'll pick up on atonement from next time, and we'll also get into at least the preamble of the Reformation. I'll argue next week that the Reformation really began with Francis of Assisi.